A very good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our MICCI webinar series 2, Between a Rock and Hard Places. Before we start, on behalf of MICCI, we would like to thank and wish all our participants for joining us today. And also additional, we'd like to wish all our Muslim friends and families Salam Eid Fitri. Thank you for joining us, for tuning in through our MICCI live stream Facebook. Today for our series 2, we have our moderator, Mr. Sean Chia, Executive Director of MICCI, and 2 distinguished panelists. They are Mr. Daman Sivalingam of Daman Sivalingam and Partners with the topic Critically Assessing Employment Law Issues in Post-MCO, followed by Mr. Sam Hege of ManpowerGroup with the topic Employment Treatment, Retention Options, Cost-Saving Options, Employment Lifecycle throughout the MCO, CMCO, and thereafter. Before we start, a short housekeeping rules. Each speaker will be given 20 minutes. Towards the end of their presentation, there will be a Q&A session. Participants are encouraged to post your questions on the Facebook Messenger. Kindly indicate your name, your company, and who the question is posted for. Hope you enjoyed the session today. Before I hand it over to our moderator, Mr. Sean, I would like to thank again our participants and panelists for the fruitful session. Mr. Sean, are you ready?
Yes, right. Thank you, Chitra. Welcome everyone to our second series of the Between a Rock and a Hard Place. If you have not participated last week's series 1, we have Leonard Tay, the panelists Leonard Tay and Victor Gan. We went through the comparison between the Singapore policies and the Malaysian ones, and then we also went through what you could do and things that you should do if you want to do cost reduction or employment optimization. Mr. Victor Gan has also given a very good insights into certain actions that dissident employees may take and how you can react and prevent something like that. So the session, last week's session, is recorded on Facebook. So do visit our Facebook and you can watch the recorded series 1. Now, this is series 2, following on to the last week's series. Now we will critically examine, re-examine employment laws. The enactment of the MCO and the CMCO is, well, I don't want to use the word, but that seems to be the current word, unprecedented. So we want to re-examine. So we are making a lot of assumptions about what existing the existing Employment Act and employment laws are applicable. But we want to critically look at re-examining the entire thing, because this is something very unusual. It's not addressed in the original employment rules and regulations. So our first panelist, Mr. Daman Sivalingam, will go through that with us. And then we have Sam Hagat. He will be giving you a very practical viewpoint on how you could transform your employees and even how you operate with the new normal, right? So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, Mr. Daman Sivalingam, and I think it's introduced by Chitra in the opening speech. He's a managing partner of Daman Sivalingam and Partners. He's going to give you a good insight into, let's re-look at the employment laws currently against what is the current MCO, CMCO condition, and maybe post MCO, what you need to do. Daman, are you ready? I pass the floor to you. You need unmute. Okay, all right.
Sorry.
Over to you.
Sorry for that schoolboy error. Hi, Sean. Hi, Sam. First and foremost, thank you guys for inviting me to share some thoughts. Hopefully, I might be able to give some useful tips for the participants. I think you coined it up quite well, Sean. There were so many issues that employment law related issues that arose during the MCO, then the CMCO, and then I think moving forward a bit of predictions as to what might be the employment laws that are relevant. That's what I'm going to be talking about. And I know I'm on a clock, so let me straight dive in there and get into my share screen. I went for a sort of old school style for my PowerPoint, which is basically code for, I got my daughter to help me out yesterday, really late. But anyway, I put my my thoughts down here, and I just want to walk through some of the issues. And I also want to re-stress what you said, Sean. The first series covered a lot of laws, employment law areas, and I don't want to restate them. I think it'll be, as you mentioned, it's still available on MICCI's Facebook. I'd urge those who are interested, from what I say, to find out more about that. Please go to those to the last series. Okay, what are the issues that I feel we faced during the MCO and thereafter? And there was one aspect which in my opinion is very important, and I think sort of the first salvo that the Ministry of HR shot out on their website set us down the wrong path, in my opinion, because the website basically said that you have to pay wages whether an employee works or not, right? So I want to re-examine that assertion. Now, and the starting point for that to me is the Employment Act in Section 2 defines wages. And I must pause to state that this point has been debated repeatedly. It continues to divide opinions. But in my view, I think the definition speaks for itself, and it states, I've highlighted the words for work done. It states basically that wages are paid for work done, right? Meaning to say, if there is no work done, especially when the situation of no work being able to be done is not at the behest or at the request of the employer, wages are not payable, meaning wages are not earned because work cannot be done. Now, the website, Ministry of Human Resources website, took a contrary position and said that you have to pay. And that was without a legal basis, because they did not talk about on what premise was that statement made. Rather, it was sort of made as a warning in the first instance, in my opinion. They changed tack a little bit thereafter, but initially they took a very strict view and saying it as if it was law. And I think when I look back at it, that's not right. Even at that point, to me, I have an opinion. I know others have different opinions, but that's my view on it. And I'd also like to challenge the opinion somewhat in that. Let's look at the essential element in an employment contract. What is the essential element there? There is an exchange of services provided by an employee for wages. Therein itself tells you that it must follow that if work cannot be done, again, through no fault of employer or employee, the services cannot be exchanged for wages. That simply has to be the logical premise. And I also would like to share that if you looked at labor law, sometimes you have to look at a bigger picture. If you look at employment laws, it covers social parts of social considerations have to come into there, and I totally respect that. I totally respect that sometimes you can't be as clinical in employment laws as you could in other areas of the law because social considerations are there. But if you looked at the situation in other countries, how did they face it? And I think the last session talked about it. The stimulus packages across the world was provided by the government to the pockets of the employees, either through the employer or directly to the employees. Why is that the case? Because they recognize that if work cannot be done, it must be unfair, surely, for an employer to still pay for wages. Because, again, to me, the premise is that exchange cannot happen, right? I would also like to talk about the one instance that we have to be conscious about is sometimes you have unscrupulous employers, right? you have unscrupulous employers who can reap the services of their employees. I think a lot of us are working effectively, maybe more so than before, from home. Now, in that instance, we shouldn't talk about are wages payable or not, because to me, work is being done. I'm talking about in cases where, like, for example, a restaurant, a waiter or a waitress, they can't provide their services from home. They have to tend to customers, they have to wait at tables, and the restaurant is closed. So in that instance, for us to say that legally you are forced to pay wages, not right. That's not the position. And I think I've given you my views as to why that's the case. What other employment law issues were important? Variations to contract of employment. This was talked about the last time, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. Basically, if you want to vary a contract, like you want to reduce salaries or ask people to go on annual leave, you need consent. Already covered. Please look at Series 1. Of course, then, as Sean rightly pointed out, if you are trying to optimize headcount, that would mean retrenchments. Already covered. Please look at Series 1. Doctrine of frustration. This is interesting. And let me try and sort of explain what it is first before I go into my thoughts on that. The definition of doctrine of frustration is this. A, an event has occurred. B, that event occurred through no fault of the employer or employee. And 3, or C, as a result of that event, the contract of employment cannot be performed anymore. Now, if you look at the 3 requirements, one would assume that the MCO would apply to say that the contract of employment is frustrated, which means it's terminated. But there is a very important aspect that we have to consider, and that for frustration to apply, there requires a sense of finality or impossibility that the contract can be performed, at least, if not forever, at least for a foreseeable future. And that's where there's a stumbling block for MCO, because the MCO was extended in dribs and drabs, 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks. So we had a sight, or at least we thought a sight of where is the end game. And therefore, in my opinion, there isn't enough sense of certainty for the doctrine of frustration to apply. And also, the CMCO then came in, and CMCO basically has allowed work to resume, so the contract can be performed. There are SOPs, obviously, that we have to comply with, but the contract can then be performed. And so the doctrine of frustration would not apply, in my opinion, with regards MCO and whether the contract can be terminated on account of frustration. The next thing that I'd like to share would be, hang on, let me just get my next slide to move on. Now, this is something that's interesting. We're talking about employers now. You're forced to basically, as business owners, you're forced to provide your services or products at a reduced price. That's just basically the key game changer, right? Everybody's going to squeeze their budgets. You want to be relevant, you've got to be cheaper. So you've got to look at various methods of doing that. For businesses where employment costs amounts to a significant part of their costs, this is going to be more compelling for them to consider. So you may want to convert people to fixed term contracts. FTC stands for fixed term contracts. So instead of me keeping someone on a permanent basis where I've got less control, but I think that this project, which now my client has said I'm terminating in 3 months, so beyond 3 months, I don't know. So I may want to convert them to a fixed term contract, or I may want to go with a daily rated contract. Basically, I will pay you in the event I have work, right? So there's still some element of control. That person is still referred to as an employee. And the more left field would be to go towards the gig economy, where literally it is pay as you go. So in that sense, and that might be something that might be the future, I feel, because you take away costs like EPF, you take away costs like SOXO, you take away annual leave costs, you take away medical leave costs, you take away medical costs, all the frills are taken away, which then means you could possibly provide a higher rate of pay, which might be something that the gig employees, I mean, a lot of employees today of the, I don't know which generation it is, are more inclined to gig work. They don't want to be shackled down to an employer just as much as an employer doesn't want to be shackled down with an employee. Now, I think Sam will probably talk a lot more around this. There are certainly some challenges on this. One of the challenges would be keeping someone on an employment contract gives you a high level of control over that person. For example, that person cannot work for anyone else. But in a gig situation, that doesn't apply, right? So if you're in an environment where confidentiality is crucial, then this might not be the tool of choice for you. But it might be in many cases that, I don't need someone to be a permanent employee. I might need, let me just pay as I want, right? So what are the laws that apply around this area? Now, a little bit technical. You break it down into EA or Employment Act staff. What do I mean by Employment Act staff? Employment Act employees are employees that come within the scope, generally speaking, are the blue-collared employees. You're talking about those whose wages do not exceed 2,000 ringgit a month, or those, even though their wages may be more than 2,000 ringgit a month, they are predominantly engaged in manual. Got your warning there, Chitra, 10 minutes, that's my yellow card. So for employees who are predominantly within the scope of the Employment Act, you have, what you need to do is you need to first terminate their existing contracts of employment before you can move them into any of this FTC, daily rated or gig, right? And if you terminate, what happens there? You will have to pay termination benefits, right? For those employees who come within the scope of the Employment Act, you are required to pay termination benefits, and the amount of termination benefits differs based on years of service. It ranges from 10 days wages for each year of service to a maximum of 20 days wages for each year of service. Now, so for EA staff specifically, for those who come within the Employment Act, my view is you cannot persuade them to be converted into a lesser contract, because that's provided in the employment termination and layoff benefits regulations. And therefore you need to terminate and you'll have to pay termination benefits. Now, for the white collar, those who are outside the Employment Act, you need to remember one thing. Once an employer has terminated the employee, he then makes an offer of either a fixed term contract or a daily rated or a gig contract. And you need to understand that employee may accept or they may not. So you're not in control to ensure that they will continue with you on a fixed term or a daily rated or gig, because you've already severed by terminating and paying termination benefits. So whether they come on board on fixed term or daily rated or gig depends on how compelling that offer is. And as I mentioned, I think you can make it compelling, because if you take away all those costs, your daily rate might be sweeter to the employee than what he is currently enjoying. Yeah. And because you might only want that employee for, say, 10 days in a month, you can actually have a 15% hike, because you know you're saving on all those other things and you're only paying for 10 days. So I think that willing buyer, willing seller platform might actually be something that's workable if this kind of tools work for the business and the employee. Now, what about for the white-collar employees or the non-Employment Act staff, those who are earning more than 2,000, executives, managers, and so on? You need to convert with their consent. So you don't have to terminate. You can go to them and tell them, hey guys, I can't continue to keep you on employment with these terms. This is the situation. And I think Sam's going to talk a bit more about that part, which is so important. And again, ultimately, you can only do it with the consent. And you've got consent has been already been covered in our first series. So please go back to that slide, to that session to hear from the panelists on how you can procure consent. So these are the issues that I feel have been relevant, the employment law issues that have been relevant during the MCO, CMCO, and then the conversion is something that's, I think, starting to happen and may continue to happen post MCO even. Now, what else do I have? I think this aspect is going to be, if it already hasn't happened, it's going to be the top space for employers. you're going to talk about robust performance management. I think employers are going to be wanting their full bang for their buck. So if I'm paying an employee X amount, I want to get the exact services in response or in exchange. And basically, you're talking about clear expectations. So the setting of the clear expectations, it's got to be reasonable. You got to be thinking about all of those things. You got to communicate it in a manner that the employee understands it, right? A message that's understood by the notifier and not understood by the recipient, there's no message that's passed. Number two, I think my employers are going to be having fair but rigorous appraisals, reviews to see where the employee is against the expectations. And the legal aspect, you need to be mindful of collating evidence of any gaps in performance that you might see, because if the employee is showing gaps, it would probably mean the employer is thinking, hey, if I'm not going to get my bang for my buck, and if I've given a fair opportunity to the employee, I need to cut the umbilical cord here, you know. And so if that gets challenged in court, then you need to have this evidence, because you need to stack it up in court, demonstrate that what you did was fair. And basically the law around performance is, you need to show three things, and that's the employee must be aware of the performance gaps, he must be duly notified about it. Number two, the employee must have been given sufficient opportunity to improve, right? So reviews, pointing out of the gaps, coaching, counseling, tools to close those gaps. And the third part, and that's the part which is important, despite having done the first and the second aspects, the employee did not sufficiently improve. So you must have some method, some scale to show that the employee fell short after having done all of this. And I know that's a challenge for jobs which are not quantifiable, but are more, quality based. But, that's where the employer or the owner of the business has got to earn his keep. You've got to think about quantifying the unquantifiable. And I think Sam's got a nice piece around that, which I'm going to leave him to talk about. So I think robust performance management is just going to be a norm. I think instinctively business owners is going to be pushing this button really hard, because you just cannot allow any form of slack when there's so much of pressure on the income, right? So my message to employers is, you got to understand that the laws prescribe that if you dismiss someone on performance, you need to prove those three things if it goes there. I wish that you don't end up going there. And I think that's how I'm going to conclude hereafter. But it is the unfettered right of any employee who has been dismissed to file a complaint and trigger the process, and that could very well end up in the industrial court, regardless of whether the dismissal was the best in class dismissal, right? So the takeaway is, instead of tackling a legal problem, manage the perception so that the employee accepts the decision and is not inclined to challenge, right? You can win your case, but you don't want to go down that path. Yeah, so it's just costly, painful, and your efforts, especially during these times, should be focused on building the business, not going up and down in court and exposing yourself to cross-examination and whatnot. So robust performance management, I think, a buzzword of HR and all business owners, I think going forward is going to be really so important. In conclusion, I'd like to sort of, speak a little bit about what I ended off with earlier, which is, leaving aside the legalities. And I know I'm shooting my business in its foot by telling you this, but, forget so much about the law. Really, to me, the big takeaway now is the leadership needs to come to the fore. Right now, why do I say the leadership needs to come to the fore? Because the employer, the business owner, needs to be very clear in their direction. And that's business projections and all of that math stuff, marketing stuff, all of that's got to be done. And the leader needs to be really clear about what he's up against. Number two, the communication has to be so effective. And that's got to be driven by the leadership again. And number three, across all the decisions, across every time you communicate and how you do it, be fair. You know, this is not a time to be unfair. Everyone's got to think for everyone else. And when I say fair, I'm talking about the employer and the employee. You know, the times are such that an employer cannot afford, it might be the case that the employer cannot afford to pay as he or she did before. And if the employee is aware of this, you got to give in. You know, it's everyone's got to pull in, because survivability overtakes legalities and all other issues. And I think I'd like to leave it with that. Back to you, Sean.
Oh, hi. Thank you, Daman. Daman, could I suggest something? Just turn off your, okay, right, so that we can see you, right? Okay. Very insightful. The big challenge here, like what you mentioned about work done, the concept of work done has to be very clear. And that's very good that you have raised that. And I hope the audience now understand what does it mean by that work done philosophy, right? When you had the HR putting into a media statement right at the beginning of the MCO, saying that employers have to continue paying, blah, 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 blah. You can't do, like you say, it negates the doctrine of that work done, okay? Philosophy of work done. What it does is it created a very unusual circumstance where the employees are in a position of bargaining higher, a position of advantage in bargaining. So by you alluding to this concept of the work done, then it's sort of now the value to this series 2 is that then employers now has at least come up to that disadvantage, that there's no longer a disadvantage, that they can now start to talk to the employees, because it's a position of bargaining, right? Because the original, every lawyer in town or everyone is spewing about Employment Act, you got to follow this, you got to follow that, you got to follow the MOHR statements. That's why then it becomes skewed to one side, and then the businesses are really having that issue, right? And in terms of converting their service contracts, yes, I years ago, I mean, in another previous life, I have done something called an outsourcing. That means you transfer certain employees to another new company, and the rules then were that whatever you offer is no less than what they are enjoying at the moment, and they cannot refuse to say, I can't, I won't go. See, as long as it's better, equal or better. And like what you say is quite correct. There's a variation that you can do because of the certain savings in costs. You can convert it into incentive schemes that eventually the employee gets more in the pocket at the end of the day. So that also works. So it's something that people can think about. Before we go to the next speaker, there is a question, or rather a clarification here. Can you, Mr. Daman, can you reiterate what does gig economy or gig contract of service, what does it mean, as compared?
Okay. I think the starting point is the gig economy is one which breaks away from contract of service. See, the contract of service is basically an employer-employee relationship, right? A gig economy is one where it's a principal-contractor relationship. So what's the difference there? There are many tests that the law will use, but just to illustrate the point, see, one of the tests that the law uses is the amount of control that can be exercised over the person who's providing the service. So if you look at an employer-employee relationship, if an employee doesn't turn up to work, he's liable to disciplinary action, right? But if you look at a principal-contractor relationship, for example, I've asked someone to come and fix my roof, and he doesn't turn up. I can't issue him a show cause letter or a warning letter. So that's the difference, right? It's you lose control, but this is where I guess it comes back to trust, right? Why would the contractor not want to come to my house and earn that fee, whatever that we've agreed? So these are the differences between employer-employee relationship and principal-contractor relationship, which is what the gig is about.
Yes, I guess you can vary a gig contract in a way where there is a sum given as like a retainer to say, okay, you're supposed to turn up every Monday at 9 o'clock. All right, that is a condition of your contract, so to speak, terms, right? You can still also do something like that. And I agree with you, to be able to handle the gig, you have to have a very robust, not performance indicators too, to say what really is the fine line between whether he did do his work or did he do it in a manner where it is acceptable, right? Because to me, if I will paintbrush a wall, and to me it's okay, right? It looks nice, but maybe not to you, right? So you have to have really good, robust scope or some measurement, right? That's the key takeaway from here, right? Okay, we will go to our next speaker, Mr. Sam Haga, and he's going to talk about what now that we understand that there is a new normal in how employer-employee relationships going to be performed, and he will advise or you give his thoughts on how we could convert some of our traditional employer-employee understanding and the way we operate to the new normal. Sam, are you ready to jump in?
Yes, thank you, Sean. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, now I'll hand the floor to you, Sam.
Perfect. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion, and I hope through sharing I'll be able to leave you with some thoughts as you sit through the presentation. So first, I want to start with an apology, because it may be that I am covering topics that were covered in the previous session. But what I wanted to share with you today is a little bit of the background of what's leading us into this situation, how that's going to impact us as business leaders and as employers, and then some options in terms of what we can do to address it. Working on the basis that if we are at a stage where we're discussing the legalities of the situation, then it may be that our efforts have already failed. So hopefully we're going to work through some processes and some measures where we can avoid that. So perhaps just a little bit of background to begin with. You know, I know the word has been used to death, but we live in unprecedented times. You know, through the lockdowns in multiple countries globally, over 80% of the workforce, 2.7 billion people at some stage or other, have been impacted by this situation. So in Malaysia, we're by no means unique. And as I'm sure for those of you who've part of multinational or global organizations, you will see in different countries, people are dealing with this differently. Now, bringing it closer to home, in Malaysia, you know, the cost of the lockdown in the MCO and the global economy is set to cost us almost a quarter of the GDP of the country. So that's not an insignificant amount. So with that kind of a backdrop, what it's leading us into uncharted territories, and what again has been commonly referred to as the new normal. The new normal being is post the MCO, post the CMCO, post COVID-19, things are never going to be the same. So the organizations that are going to get ahead of this is by understanding that as a factor and starting to look at your business from an outside-in perspective. Now, one of the key things out of this situation that we find ourselves is we're moving from physical to virtual. And what you can see here on your screen is the entire life cycle of an employee. And as you can see, in almost every aspect of that life cycle, automation or virtual interaction is becoming more and more prevalent, from onboarding staff virtually, interviews, conducting performance reviews, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as the presentation moves, things are becoming more virtual. So what does that mean? It means that the demand on leaders and managers is becoming much, much more dynamic than it's ever been before. You know, if your workforce, despite the CMCO, most organizations have some element of their workforce that's not working in the office. So we're expecting our managers and leaders to be able to manage in extremely difficult circumstances without having the physical contact with their employees. So that requires different competencies, different skill sets, and certainly a completely different approach to how we've approached performance management, how we've approached engagement in the past. So with that in mind, I want to move things back a little bit to look at what is important to the employees. You know, we talk an awful lot about Maslow's or our own hierarchy of needs. At a baseline, every organization needs to be able to establish its foundation on a very strong culture and a focus on the employee's well-being. This is absolutely important. This is not a nice to have, but absolutely important. And depending on individuals' needs, it's anything from make sure I get paid on time all the way through to having a sense of purpose, rallying every single employee in the organization towards a common objective. And what you will see in the structure is two fundamentally important things. Number one, and you see that horizontally across the board, is flexibility. And that is, we have to view work in the way it's being done, how it's being done, who does it in a completely different way. We talked about gig economy, we talk about part-timers, we talk about flexible workforce. So the hallmark of all of this is the level of flexibility. And we're seeing that manifest itself in some of our employees who have been working for a significant amount of time from home. When they're being called back to work in the office, some of them are naturally reluctant to be able to do that. They've established a way of working, they have family commitments. So we need to understand that the impact of the MCO, the CMCO, and COVID-19 is going to go well beyond the day-to-day impact that was before. It's going to have a lasting effect. The second very, very important thing is transparency and honesty in terms of communicating what is happening within the organization. You know, I was brought up in a system where it was very, very hierarchical. The boss made decisions and you simply followed. We live in an age now where it's super important to make sure that everybody within the organization understands where the organization is going, what challenges are you facing, what are you planning to do, and what the implication of that is on individuals. So to sum it up, first and foremost, pay is always going to matter. Yes, there are certain parts or certain positions within the organization where people are more motivated by the challenge, but in the vast majority of organizations, we're dealing with a workforce who have to put food on the table. So it's absolutely important to make sure that that baseline is covered. The second thing is it's no longer one size fits all. One size fits one. So we have to be very clear on what the needs of our individual employees are and cater to that need. Does that mean we're going to make everybody happy? No, but we need to be able to recognize the needs of those individuals and look at, or at least demonstrate, the organization's willingness to be able to find a solution that will meet their specific needs. A classic example of that, if you have two members of the family who are working, the husband is going back to work because of the nature of the MCO, they can't get home care. So one of the partners is going to have to work from home. So you need to be able to understand the personal circumstances that could lead to a situation where you're required to approach the situation with a different mindset. One of the things, the great learnings for myself personally and our organization throughout the MCOs is we've been able to discover some amazing hidden talent within the organization. You know, they say in adversity comes true leadership, and we've had some amazing discoveries about people within the organization who've demonstrated great traits. And that's come from our ability to be able to provide some level of variety to the employees, put them in situations that they've not been in, whether it's how they execute work or in virtually leading certain teams. But again, variety is the spice of life. And that applies not just to the work that you're providing to the individuals, but how you look at shaping the organization moving forward. And last but not least, and I've talked about that quite a lot, and that's flexibility. You have to have that mindset in terms of how do I get the organization to be flexible enough to be able to accommodate the needs of my employees while achieving my objective. And again, that requires a certain level of outside in and also some level of introspection in terms of, you know, what you did before and how you can do it differently moving forward. Just sharing some of my personal experiences, I can tell you that in the last 2 months, I have held more town halls with our employees than I have done in my last 2, possibly 3 years. So you hear it said an awful lot: communicate, communicate, communicate. Now, communication is not a one-way traffic. Very often we confuse communication with speech making and getting the point across. But as I've learned through this period, it's more important to listen than to speak. So when you speak, it has some relevance and some impact on the individuals that you are speaking to. And again, complete transparency and openness and honesty is absolutely essential, because as Darman has mentioned earlier, and Sean also alluded to it, there's going to be a high level of anxiety. The worst thing that a situation like this presents is uncertainty, is people not knowing what's going to happen. The fact that they're not in the office together, the fact that they are, you know, not able to see, not able to sense what's happening within the organization, means that communications take on a much more important role in terms of people understanding. So, you know, I've lost count of how many Zoom calls that we've had. I seem to spend most of my day with Zoom calls. But one of the interesting things, again, that I have learned is you have to be able to read between the lines. You know, I work for an organization, we're in the service industry, so we measure many things. And sometimes it's difficult. You tend to sort of lose the wood for the trees, because you're measuring lots of things, but you're perhaps losing the essence of, why is the performance of this individual dropping? And is there something that I need to check? Is there anything that I, you know, is there a welfare call that I need to make just to ask how a person is? Certain home situations could impact the work-life balance. And that makes life a lot difficult when you're not seeing the individual, you're not having those day-to-day interactions. So within the organization, we've implemented many schemes. And one of them that's been particularly effective is what we call team buddies. So we've teamed people from across the world to connect with somebody. So it's almost like the old-fashioned pen pals, where you write to somebody halfway across the world and you develop a strong relationship over that. And it's been absolutely astounding in terms of our ability to connect together as human beings, and also share our challenges, and also understand and learn from each other in terms of, you know, what's working and what's not. So in essence, the important thing is keeping in touch. The human element during this period of time takes on a whole new importance. You know, we can get caught up a lot in the technology and what it provides us. And, you know, we've learned a great deal about what we can do without physically being present. But the important thing is to make sure that we stay connected. So one of the things that we've experienced over this period of time is different organizations have handled the economic situation in different ways. We have organizations that have been very clear-cut. You know, my revenue base is this, I need to make a certain amount of profit, I have too many people, therefore I'm going to cut. And the way they've gone about doing that, whilst maybe compliant, but is not necessarily humane. And the one thing I would say, if you take nothing away from what I'm sharing with you now, as one thing, is COVID-19 will be gone, but the organization and reputational damage to organizations who mistreat their employees will last for much, much, much longer than that. And remember one thing, in Malaysia, we are talent strapped. There aren't enough people to fuel and to drive the jobs that we need. Yes, jobs are going to be changing, and this situation is presenting difficulties in terms of being able to retain the workforce. So it's important that we think outside the traditional box. And I'll share with you one particular example which struck me a lot. Manufacturing industry, as we all know, is all about physical presence. You know, it's an industry that's been severely impacted by this crisis, and is also, if you speak to many of them, is very, very sensitive to profitability. So we were working with one particular organization who are contemplating making dramatic cuts. And we said to them, give us 48 hours. Let's just look at what's happening within your organization. Let's look at the data and see if we can come up with some solutions. And the interesting thing is we discovered that this organization was paying almost a third of their total cost in overtime and allowances. And by redistributing that across the workforce, eliminating overtime, changing the work shift, they were actually able to sustain the same workforce through this difficult period of time without actually increasing their costs, or actually able to meet their cost. So the point I'm making is we have to unlearn all of the habits that we've had in the past and look at how we're going to do things in the future. We have to challenge what perhaps brought us to this point as organizations and think about what's going to take us to the next level. So in terms of workforce, you know, the first thing that we have to look at is the flexibility of the working model. Does the position need to be full-time? Could it be done by part-timers? You know, do we have to have one full-time person, or could we have that job divided across 2 or 3 part-timers that may work in a flexible basis? Bearing in mind that as a result of this, people are now much more conscious of the flexibility of their work environment. Second thing is the workplace flexibility. You know, it's all very well for us to have all our people in one place, and we're an organization where, you know, 90% of our core employees are based in a single location. So it's very, very easy to be comfortable in terms of having everybody in there. You know, we support the business process outsourcing industry, which typically is centered through significant centers, and you have lots of people working there. The one thing that we've learned through this process is work still can get done through remote work. And what's even more interesting is you don't even have to have people in the same country. You know, when you're dealing with knowledge-based work, we've had people who are stuck in their home countries and they were not able to come back, yet they were able to continue to work and continue to contribute despite the fact that they're not in the country, let alone in the same office. So how work gets done is going to fundamentally have to change. Now, again, not everybody's going to be able to work from home, and for many organizations like manufacturing with some core functions, they need to be on the shop floor, but nevertheless, the way work can get done is, you know, there's more than one way to do that. The final one is compensation. I kind of touched on it a little bit, where traditionally in certain industries, there are certain variable incomes, there's a certain guarantee of overtime, etc. And by being transparent and communicating to the community of your employees, you know, you're going to be able to explain to people that, you know, we're not going to be in a position to pay overtime. Maybe we're not going to be able to pay commissions, at least for now. So that could be paused or maybe even suspended altogether. In some cases, as we have experienced ourselves, is people understand if they have to take a pay cut for a period of time to preserve the greater good of the organization. So if there are any key takeaways I would like you to have from my presentation is throw away the rule book. Everything that we have ever done before, everything that we've sort of learned in management one-on-one is no longer going to be relevant to the situation that we have. And each one of us, everybody who's facing this situation is going to have their own unique challenges. And when you apply that to your employees, then you can multiply that by a factor of many, many times. So the key is to be open, honest, and transparent in all of your communications with the organization. Make sure that everybody knows what is happening, why it is happening, but it's also important to demonstrate that you have a clear understanding and a clear vision in terms of where the solution is going to be and what the end point is. Regularly communicate to your employees where you are in the grand plan. Are you on track? Are things getting worse? Are things getting better, so that they can understand what's going to happen? And then the final thing is make absolutely certain that you communicate your expectations with a level of clarity that you have never done before. In our organization, what we've boiled things down to is a single expectation from each individual. So they know exactly how to measure their performance by that single metric. Whether it's a number, whether it's an output, it is that single metric. Because in that situation, you have absolute clarity of purpose. There's no ambiguity. And one of the important things here is to be sure, because there could be lots of activities. You know, many organizations measure lots of aspects of activity. But at the end of the day, your organization's survival is going to be based on an outcome. So if you're measuring the activity, please ensure that you have direct line of sight between that activity and the outcome. But where you can, align your compensation with the outcome. And that's a way to think through your compensation moving forward. And this is the great thing about the gig model. It's a classic situation whereby you're trading control for output. And I would even say that you're not actually trading control, because if you say to an individual, I'm going to pay you X amount of ringgit for a piece of work to be done, now you can do that in a day or you can do that in a month. Guess what? If they can do that in a day and get the job done, they'll do it in a day. Win-win for everybody. Number one is the service provider is going to increase their capacity to be able to provide income. Second, the organization is going to benefit greatly because you're aligning cost with output. And with that, I will hand over back to you, Sean.
Right. Thank you, Sam. Very insightful. Yes, there is. I would coin this as a workplace transformation. That is how we are going to go to the future, right? I think one of the biggest challenges to overcome, and this is something I experienced during the days where I was doing a lot of business transformation and outsourcing projects. It is this psychology of the bosses, the business owners has to change. What is this psychology? The premise is that either you hire a person for his time, or you hire someone for the outcome, right? So there are traditional bosses who say, hey, I'm paying you and I want you to be sitting there at 9 o'clock till 5 o'clock, right? But then the question is, like what you alluded to, Sam, you say, if I can finish something within a month or 6 months, which should I do, right? So it's the same premise that someone could clock in religiously at 9 every day, sits in his desk and just stare at a piece of blank paper till 5 o'clock, I clock out, and that's it. And you say, wow, you see, this is a very good employee. But then the factor is that if another person doesn't even come in at all, but yet keeps delivering the sales that you have applied to him, so which do you want to pay? You see, so it is overcoming this psychology of the bosses. And the
Absolutely.
MCO was very good in that way, because it get everyone to experience what it is, that the ability to handle work from home, right? And which this is leading me to the next thing that I'm just about to suggest. Like what Mr. Daman has said, that on the premise that if an employee is moved from one contract to another with no reduction in benefits, his current benefits. All right, so it is one of those things that Sam you're talking about is a transformation into a more flexible contract, right? Then the next question that begs is that how do you quantify is something like working from home, which is flexibility, right? Working from home actually is a benefit. It's very hard to quantify, but it's a benefit.
Absolutely.
I save money on clothes. You know, I don't have to dress up and buy. Well, I mean, there are people who do so. I mean, but then again, we could have it every Wednesday or Mondays. They come in and they can still dress up, right? Cost of fuel, you know, and transportation. I don't need to be in a jam, getting to work and stuff like that. Then there's also flexibility in terms of time. I mean, I can run to the bank, and if the plumber calls, I don't have to apply leave and stuff like that. So that can, I don't know how you see it, Daman. Is it can it be quantified as a better benefit over current benefits? You know.
Great question, Sean. I mean, I think the fact that, okay, let me step back again. That's a gray area. It's a matter of opinion, but my view, the fact that all three of us were sort of nodding as you said it's a benefit, suggests that it's just a question of quantification and not a debate about is it a benefit or not. So to me, personally, and I'm putting myself in that shoes, if when I was back working, if somebody gave me that, I would take 15%, 20% pay cut, no problems. I'll be happy to. You know, so, but that's my quantification. But I guess everyone would be able to see that value. You know, it's just prescribing or ascribing a value is going to be the dodgy one. But just the stuff you talked about, parking, traveling, that's something that you could identify to some fair degree of accuracy. You know, and but I guess my answer to you is, I would view that from a legal standpoint. If I'm going to persuade a judge, just like the three of us could see it being a value, I think you would be able to persuade a judge that because I allowed for this, I reduced the salary. I think that can fly. Now, of course, if you reduce the salary by 90%, the judge is going to think, you know, come on, buddy, you know, but so there's got to be that element of fairness. But I would say that I think it can be demonstrated as such.
All right.
Yeah, and I think this is where the one size fits one becomes very, very important, because for different jobs, that benefit is going to translate itself in different ways. The other thing is as well to stress is this is about change management. You know, human beings, we're hardwired for homeostasis. We don't like change too much, to be quite candid. So it's being able to understand the individual circumstances, aligning that with a need within the company, and finding a common objective. Because more often than not, that flexibility. So we talked about fuel, we talked about parking. We could also talk about childcare. We could also talk about supporting the elderly. We could also talk about the fact that most people working from home, and there are lots of statistics to support this, are actually far more productive than people who come to the office. Because when you think about the commute time that you lose from the time you leave your home to the time that you get to the office and back, in fact, working from home, the watch out is that you don't get people burning out by overdoing it. There it's a question of balancing the priorities. But absolutely. And again, it could well be that the compensation is aligned more with the outcome. So the onus is on the employer. So for example, let's just use a simple example of somebody who can do content review, for want of a better description. You could align the compensation based on the number of transactions that are completed. You can do this in financial transactions. You can do that in customer service transactions. You can do that in almost any area where the output of that individual is quantifiable. So the question is, if you cannot quantify the output, then you must examine the validity of that role and the continuity of it. If you can't measure the value of what that person produced, then you already have a problem. So the key is to be able to get that level of clarity for employees, and that in itself will drive the productivity of the individual. because they then own their own performance. Now, it may not be the same for everybody, and there will be people who will not choose that. Now, then you need to make a decision of whether your organization can support that type of an individual long term.
Yeah, okay, I agree with you. One of those things that I did those days when I did the outsourcing was this a profit sharing with the staff, right? So there is an ownership of performance, right? It's that's why they are able. It's something which is not exactly quantifiable, but it is quantifiable by prior years numbers to say, okay, right. Normally we will achieve X dollars of sales or profit, and if it reaches that amount, then each of you will get X percentage or something like that, right? So it's a potential increase in what's going to be in your pocket, and it's quite healthy in that way because it creates this a peer pressure to say that, okay, even though I'm the accounts clerk, and I may not be in the front line influencing revenue, but hey, if I see that there's certain leakages here, or rather to be candid about it, if I see you slacking off, then I am a vested interest, and I say, hey, I think you better get out of here and just fix that issue, because it is affecting my thing. So in a way, it does have some pull factor in that way. I guess it's just about now.
It's changing the metric. Typically sales has been incentivized on revenue. Okay, right. So why don't you change that to profit? Bottom line profit for the organization.
Yeah,
and you have the organization working together.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, salaries or employment cost traditionally is something which is what accountants call a fixed overhead. Fixed. And if you convert it into variable costs, I mean, you do the same, you get back the same thing. It's good times you get good, the bad, then your margins are still there. It's some concept that a lot of bosses have to take cognizance of. And I would like to also just tell a little story of how I found about this, about bosses needing or business owners needing to change a certain mindset, and how difficult it is to really come back with a robust performance management, KPIs and scope of work. It's quite difficult because smaller companies, and this is a real life example, this supplier was audited by the client, right? They want to audit it to see whether they have robust systems in place, as a supply to a big MNC. So it's a small company. So they were looking, they asked the boss, do you have a job description of this engineer, or whatever the name is? It's part of those, I need to see documentation. And you know what the guy says? The guy says his job description is what I tell him to do. So that it's very undefined. You see, sometimes I've got my dry cleaning. I need someone to help me to pick it up, or can you run up there and fix something? So it's all this flexibility that a boss wants. That's why there would be some resistance into going into a gig economy, gig employment contractor point of view, that I can't shout at someone to do that stuff. Okay, right. Anything else?
I think you've made a great point. And one of the things is with so many organizations, you see very detailed and beautifully written job descriptions. But the single factor that's not there is what's the output? How do you measure that person's contribution to the organization? And if there is one thing that most organizations should be preoccupied with right now, is go back to, for every single role that you have in your organization, and unless you can articulate the output from that position in one or two clearly measurable metrics, then you have to ask yourself the question whether the role needs to be there.
Yeah. Daman, any?
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, that tees me up nicely in terms of retrenchments. That's one of the legal requirements as shared in the last session, the role must be either redundant or surplus to requirement. That's got to be demonstrable, and if you revisit it in the way Sam has said, right? And so you're now cognizant of the fact that really I don't need this role. Now, obviously, you need some level of evidence to demonstrate that in court. And that can be challenging because you have an opponent who's trying to stop you from demonstrating that to court, right? But to me, if you have that clarity, and maybe I'm a wishful thinker, but if it's driven by that, what Sam just said, where the penny has dropped and you realize that this role is really redundant, I'd like to take my chances on trying to demonstrate that to a judge, so and that is a requirement of the law.
Yeah, and the retrenchment thing, this was another issue here that I did raise it up. You talk about the normal retrenchment rules it's okay, same category, LIFO, last in, first out. Okay, now again, this MCO has given a very strange working, 50% of workforce, right? Okay, so now you have two guys, right? Same job, production operator or whatever it is, same job, same category. One serves maybe 6 months, one is 1 month, okay? Now, the guy who is 1 month is more active and more progressive and passionate. So when I'm the boss, I would naturally choose the 1 month old guy to be working during the MCO, okay, out of 50. So the other guy sits at home, all right? Now this is where it becomes unfair. And when the time comes for me to make retrenchments, then I'm forced to let go the 1 month old guy who is more passionate, who actually did work during MCO, and keep the guy who didn't work, sit at home and get his pay. So it's an anomaly, right? And one of the desired outcomes of this webinar, we are going to let the industrial court and the labor court judges be aware of such anomalies, so that they when they make the decisions are not based on previous case laws, which are quite different from where we are now, right? It's also in consideration of exactly what Mr. Daman, you have said about what is work done, right? So it's also about that too. So this is the reason why we wanted to have this webinar. There was a question about whether there are going to be a lot of industrial and labor court cases. I think I did allude to that last week, that because of the inconsistencies, there's going to be inundated with that. And it's a very simple thing, because an employee does not really cost him money. He will say, let's try my luck. Okay, all he does is he goes up and sits there, wait half an hour for him to see the industrial court, the people, or the labor court file a case, and that's it. But for the employer, like what Mr. Daman and yourself, you say that employer then has to go and show and demonstrate this and that evidence and stuff like that. So it does cost the employer a lot of time and effort. Can you imagine you have 3,000 staff and you let go 1,005? So there are going to be 1,005 court cases. You'll tie you up for the next 6 to 1 year. Then you will keep going through and then stuff like that. It is real concern. That's why we want to somehow signal back to the Ministry of Human Resource that this storm is coming. You have to be prepared for it. You have to do something, fast tracking, or maybe in some way put a pronouncement that, hey, if we find that your case by the employee is frivolous, then there is some repercussions, blah blah blah. I don't know what it is, right? Is that what we also want to signal up to the ministry, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and just to add also to that point, I think it's also important to do two things. Number one is, as Darman mentioned earlier, to demonstrate the implications on the long term of the company. Because if you're letting go of 1,500, you're also saving the jobs of another 1,500. So it's important to put some context into the decision. And if you're regularly communicating what's happening within the organization and maintaining that, it's very easy to be able to articulate that to an officer in a labor case. The second, which I think is going to be as important, if perhaps not even more important, is to be able to demonstrate that this employee has had clarity in terms of what is expected of them, and they've not been able to deliver for whatever reason. That's, if that could be documented, it also could help when you're making the decision between retaining an employee who's been in the company for a long time but has just simply not been productive, or in some instances where the company's needs are now going to be different from the skill sets or the competencies that this individual has. This is a reality of life. I think the discussion with the MHR becomes really important to contextualize that the direction we're taking all of our companies from this point forward is going to be substantially different from what we have done in the past. So if we're tackling a new problem with the same method that we were tackling the old, we're not going to get a good outcome. And I think, there's a role to play for employers and organizations like us, organizations like MICCI, to be able to engage with the government, because governments by their very nature are to enforce regulations. They're not per se innovators. And again, you don't want too many politicians being too innovative, because we know what the potential outcome is. So they are enforcing regulations which hold the infrastructure and which is very important for the country. So I think the onus is on us to be able to proactively communicate that to the government and communicate potential solutions for them to, to be able to start resolving that. I don't think we should just say, right, this is the problem from MHR, now you guys go fix it. I think we need to, we have a role to play in terms of finding solutions and anticipating that as a problem.
If I can chime in, Sean and Sam, I mean, I think what we're talking about is the number of cases that we're expecting, and I can back that up with some research. The last time we had a downturn in economy, there was a spike in retrenchment cases, and I'm sure it'll be the same with the Labor Department. And I think that spike is going to be minuscule compared to what we're going to see because of what's happening and what's going to happen. I guess what we're trying to say is these authorities need to approach these issues with sensibility, because the decisions were made on the back of something that nobody could understand, nobody could predict what is going to happen. So, I know that generally the laws tend to be more pro-employee, but this is the time where the authorities need to dial that back in a little bit. But here's the challenge, guys. We have a government that wants to be populist. And that's why you had all of those things on the Ministry of HR website. So, it's a tough one. But if they're going to use the platforms that are existing in the way it always was, which is pro-employee, if I'm gonna put you under a microscope and ask you to demonstrate to a high level that what you did was fair, employers are they're gonna fail, because don't forget the practicality of trying to demonstrate this is really tough. It takes about 9 months to a year for a case to get to court. With the MCO, that might go up to 2 years. Do you think you're going to remember what happened 2 years ago well enough? And if the court is going to expect such a high bar, I shudder for employers.
You're right.
I think the other factor as well to remember is that this situation is impacting the large organizations as well as the small. Large organizations have resources to be able to fight cases, but when you have such a significant percentage of the SMEs being impacted, I think you have to consider what the outcome is for many of these cases going through, because as you've rightly said, Darman, some of these organizations cannot sustain their existence for that length of time and fight a costly IR case over many, many years. So it is a difficult conundrum for the government, because they're hardwired to protect the rights of the employees, and rightly so, because you have employers who don't take good care of their employees. But I think a balance, some practicality, I think is very, very important, and also some guidelines, because in many cases the officer referral rate is in the high 90 percentile. I mean, it's almost 100%. So there's got to be some kind of a rationalization. There's got to be some level of maybe even training or coaching the individuals that are dealing with these cases, because they're simply not going to be equipped to deal with this kind of situation. Many of them are young people who will have never experienced this kind of a situation to this extent in their lives. So, it's a multifaceted challenge that the government has got ahead of it.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. And some last words that I say. I think we also have to engage. I guess we instead of going directly to the ministry, we have forgotten that we need to engage unions, right? I think they might be the first ones to start with, but possibly, yeah. Knowing them, they tend to be even worse. Well, very one-sided, and they always keep saying that, oh, we are a union, we are here as a partner with your business, but it doesn't work that way, right? I mean, we can put on the table, hey, look, if we don't do something about it, 6 months, 3 months later, we close shop, and that's something I said also last week, that if a lot of employees think that they can squeeze certain compensation out of businesses by taking them, I mean, it's a chance. I say, okay, it's like, taking a chance. It doesn't cost me a lot. I just go and lodge a case, and I win, I get 2 months, that kind of stuff. But like what you have said, a court case may take a year or so just to get it to be finalized. And within that year, hey, if it is a SME or whatever, or even an MNC, they may just close shop, move to Vietnam or other places, and then, hey, Bob's your uncle, you're gonna get zero. You think the government's gonna come back and say, I'm sorry, this company left the country, here you are, I pay you up. No way. So that's why I'm just saying, if there's any potential employees out there who is thinking otherwise, I need you to think again. You got to work with the business. They are the guys that are paying you your salary. It's not that you are you're obligated to be paid. That's the message that I want to give. Right? Okay. I don't think there is any more questions from the floor. If that was the case, then I'll hand it back to. Thank you guys for your insightful presentations. I'll hand you back to close off the webinar. And to all audience, thank you for listening. Watch this space. We normally have every Thursday, or if time be, it could be Wednesday. And I think next week is a breather, and watch out for the following week. Okay, every Thursday by a rule, general rule. Okay, thank you. And here's back to Chitra.
Thank you, Mr. Sean. We have come to an end of our webinar. I hope you had a wonderful session. On behalf of MICCI, we'd like to thank everyone who tuned into our Facebook Live, our moderator, Mr. Sean, and our speakers, Mr. Daman Sivalingam and Mr. Sam Hagen. Our apologies if all our questions are not picked up, but we will try on maybe our next webinar, we will try to answer them. Do keep in touch with us in the coming weeks for more exciting webinars. Until then, thank you once again for joining us. Stay safe, stay healthy. From MICCI, take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.